Today. This hearing, entitled "The Biden Administration's Policy Priorities for Latin America and the Caribbean," will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something in the record, please have your staff email previously mentioned address and contact some subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRS 8, the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. I want to begin by congratulating you, Assistant Secretary Nichols, on your confirmation. I know you come to this role with a great deal of experience in the region and an impressive depth of knowledge about the challenges we face. I am confident that our policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean is in good hands. As we all know, it is a turbulent time for the Western Hemisphere. This region has been hit harder by the COVID-19 pandemic than anywhere else in the world. With Daniel Ortega's coronation ceremony last week, there is no doubt that we are dealing with 3 fully consolidated dictatorships in Latin America and the Caribbean. While these regimes in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua tighten their grip on power, in other countries like Guatemala and El Salvador, we are seeing major setbacks to judicial independence, the fight against corruption, and the rule of law. In my view, the Biden administration came into office with the right approach to elevate Central America as a strategic priority and renew our focus on addressing the root causes of migrations. Unfortunately, we have seen in the last 10 months that there are limitations to what we can achieve when we lack reliable government partners. For this reason, the newly announced effort by the administration to focus on assistance and supporting local organizations in Central America is a positive and important step. Despite the serious challenges confronting the region, I also see many opportunities for greater engagement. In this sense, I applaud the Biden administration budget request, which would increase our funding for Latin America and the Caribbean by over 15% to the highest level in more than a decade. I also commend this administration for donating over 50 million vaccine doses to the region. While I was frustrated that we could not take action sooner to deliver the vaccine, this is still a major accomplishment that demonstrates our collective commitment to our friends in Latin America and the Caribbean. The next step will be supporting the region's economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I traveled to the Dominican Republic with my ranking member, Member Green, in September. The government there is making progress in reforming the police and fighting corruption. Like most countries in the region, they want our support for their economic recovery. I hope we can discuss today how we can spur greater investment and strengthen supply chains in the Western Hemisphere. As we think about how to compete effectively with China, we need to use our competitive advantage. This means tapping into our innovative private sector and deepening our network of alliances. Simply criticizing countries for doing business with China will not get us very far. We need to be at the table offering credible solutions and providing serious alternatives. We should also use our convening power to bring governments together to address challenges that transcend borders, such as the impact of climate change and increased migration from South America through the Darien Gap. Ultimately, our commitment to democracy and human rights should be the backbone of everything we do. We must be consistent in standing up to these values across the region. In Honduras' upcoming elections, we should work closely with our partners to ensure the international community speaks with one voice that is informed by the assessment of the AOS and the EU election observers. I am deeply concerned by the pre-election violence we are seeing there. In Haiti, we are witnessing the complete deterioration of the state. The U.S. must engage Haitian civil society and support Haitian-led efforts to restore peace, security, and human dignity. In Cuba, the Biden administration and the bipartisan members of Congress have taken a firm stand in defense of universal human rights. But as we saw again yesterday, the regime is doubling down on its repression. We need to do more to expand internet access and the exploitation of Cuban medical workers and unite international allies behind Cuba's demand for freedom and self-determination. As for Nicaragua, I look forward to seeing how we can work with the administration to implement the recently passed RENACEL Act and coordinate our action with allies in Latin America and the European Union to further restrict international financing to the Ortega regime. We must never lose sight of the continued political and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and the impact it is having on Colombia and other allies throughout the region. Maduro's crimes against humanity should never be normalized. The landscape across the region is challenging, but if we want to advance a more prosperous, sustainable, and democratic future for this hemisphere, we must begin by establishing Latin America and the Caribbean as a priority for U.S. foreign policy. Thank you, and I now turn to the ranking member, Mark Green, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Sears, for holding the hearing, and it's great to see you again. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Nichols, for your testifying today, and it's great to meet you as well. For too long, Congress has overlooked the Western Hemisphere, a region critical to the economic growth and national security of the United States. As ranking member, and I think I can say on behalf of the chairman as well of this subcommittee, it is our top priorities to refocus U.S. public policy on this important region. America faces many challenges in the Western Hemisphere that have to be addressed. Illegal migration is one particular problem. Recently released data shows that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection detained more than 1.7 million migrants along our southern border in fiscal year 2021, a record high. There's no easy fix to this challenge. On the one hand, we have to reduce the pull factors. For example, President Biden's egregious proposal to pay certain illegal immigrants $450,000 each, which will only further encourage migrants to make the dangerous journey north. But we also need to address the root causes of migration, such as a lack of economic opportunity, rampant corruption, and significant levels of crime. Mexico is a key ally with whom we must work to address these issues, and I'd like to hear more from the administration about the status of our security cooperation between the United States and Mexico, considering the recent record levels of illegal migration, as well as a record level of fentanyl coming into the United States. I understand the administration is trying to find new ways to stop the criminal cartels that are trafficking in fentanyl, cocaine, and other drugs. The status quo, though, is not acceptable to the committee and likely not to you either. I believe one of the solutions is not more handouts or foreign aid, but trade. Assistant Secretary, I look forward to working with you on improving the business environment and finding nearshoring opportunities to reduce the flow of illegal migrants into the United States. I've spoken with many businessmen who are dying to invest in Latin America, but are hesitant due to crime and corruption, as well as a patchwork of confusing trade regulations. Another challenge the United States faces in the region is despotic regimes that trample on the rights of their own people. Cuba, Venezuela, and now Nicaragua are particularly egregious offenders. For over 60 years, Cubans have been held hostage by a tyrannical dictatorship. The communists have bankrupted a beautiful country, condemning 3 generations to misery and separating countless families. I've been encouraged to see Cubans rise up in protest against the regime in recent months, and I was proud to support a bipartisan resolution 2 weeks ago in support of the Cuban people. I'm also deeply concerned about the 9 Americans unlawfully detained by the Maduro regime, one of them being from Tennessee, Matthew Heath. I recently met with the relatives of Tommy Vidal, who, one of the Citgo 6 oil executives, also unlawfully detained by the Maduro regime. My heart breaks for his wife and daughters, who later this month will mark 4 years separated from their husband and their father. We need to know more about what the administration is doing to bring home Mr. Vidal and the other Americans unlawfully incarcerated. Additionally, Nicaragua is now Latin America's 3rd socialist dictatorship. The recent so-called elections were a farce. Make no mistake, Daniel Ortega is a dictator and an illegitimate president. My colleagues and I were proud to support the bipartisan Renacer Act to hold the Ortega regime accountable and increase pressure on corrupt regime officials who've dismantled their country's democracy. The U.S. also faces the growing challenge of malign Chinese influence in the region. The Chinese Communist Party has been working furiously to buy off our neighbors in Latin America through its Belt and Road Initiative. However, partnering with Beijing always comes with strings attached. Over the past decade, countries in the Western Hemisphere have outsourced much of their manufacturing to China. While Latin American currencies increased in value because of the China commodities boom, many of these same countries chose to purchase relatively cheaper Chinese goods, leading to less demand for and a drying up of their own manufacturing base. This has led to an increase in unemployment and an over-reliance on Chinese manufactured goods. I'm working on a bill that will prioritize moving critical parts of our supply chain out of China and back to the Western Hemisphere among our allies and partners. Not only will this bill help confront the rise of China in the region, but will also increase economic opportunities and reduce some of the push factors leading to illegal migration. It's a win for the United States, and it's a win for Latin America. Thank you again, Chairman Sears, for holding this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our witness. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Green. I will now introduce the Honorable Brian A. Nichols, Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Mr. Nichols is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with over 30 years of experience in the State Department. Assistant Secretary Nichols has served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Zimbabwe from 2018 to 2021, and as U.S. Ambassador to Peru from 2014 to 2017. He has also held high-level positions in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, the Office of Caribbean Affairs, and the U.S. Embassy in Colombia. Assistant Secretary Nichols has earned 24 awards during his diplomatic career, including two Presidential Meritorious Service Award and the 2016 Charles E. Cobb Jr. Award for Initiative and Success in Trade Development. Mr. Nichols, we thank you for your distinguished service, and we welcome you to the hearing. I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Nichols, you are recognized for your testimony.
Chairman Sears, Ranking Member Green, thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding our efforts to advance the President's and the Secretary's agenda in the Western Hemisphere. The President and the Secretary deeply value the Western Hemisphere's central role in the welfare of the United States and understand that we cannot separate our country's fortunes from that of our closest neighbors. This administration seeks to promote a more inclusive, green, secure, prosperous, and democratic hemisphere aligned with U.S. values and interests. In my first week in this job, I joined the Secretary, Deputy Secretary, and Undersecretary for Political Affairs, along with other principals at the United Nations General Assembly for over 20 engagements with Western Hemisphere leaders. During my first 2 months as Assistant Secretary, I have visited Haiti, Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, and Canada, and met with the diaspora communities in Miami and New York to advance these priorities. Today, I want to share with you our efforts to help the Haitian people with the ongoing crisis in their country, address irregular migration and its root causes, bolster the Hemisphere's commitment to inclusive democracy, promote public health and economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic in the Americas, including through the administration's Build Back Better World initiative, and work with partners to promote democracy in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. Haiti struggles with political, humanitarian, and stabilization turmoil compounded by the July 7th assassination of President Jovenel Moïse and the August 14th earthquake. NSC Senior Director Juan Gonzalez and I traveled to Miami and Haiti September 30th to October 1st. Undersecretary for Civilian Security Azra Zaya visited Haiti on October 12th and 13th. And Assistant Secretary for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Todd Robinson traveled to Haiti November 8th to 10th to underscore the administration's commitment to the Haitian people. In our meetings with the Haitian diaspora, civil society, political actors, and Prime Minister Ariel Henry, we encouraged the Haitian people to find their own solutions and chart a broad and inclusive resolution to the current political impasse. We expressed our concerns about Haiti's security, noting stakeholders' view that insecurity would not allow for democratic elections this year. The Haitian people will determine a timeline for their elections, but we work now to support conditions for free and fair elections, including responding to the Haitian government's request to help restore security and address gang violence. In addition to our previously planned assistance, we will provide an additional $15 million to help build Haitian National Police capacity to combat gangs, expand community policing efforts, upgrade corrections facilities, and provide necessary security equipment. The kidnapping by a Haitian gang of 16 Americans and 1 Canadian serving with Christian Aid Ministries tragically illustrated Haiti's problematic security situation. The department has no greater priority than the safety and welfare of U.S. citizens abroad. We sent additional personnel and resources to Haiti to support efforts to return these U.S. citizens to safety. Haiti's crises contributed to the complex dynamic of migratory flows in the Americas. We have broadened our efforts to address irregular migration throughout the hemisphere. The President's February 2nd executive order directed a new and comprehensive approach to address regional migration. As part of that approach, the State Department implements aspects of the administration's root causes strategy and the collaborative migration management strategy. We impress upon countries in the region the shared responsibility the region has to address the issue collaboratively. The Secretary and Administrator Power met on September 24th with Mexican and Central American foreign ministers in New York to discuss regional migration. The Secretary and I on October 20th joined ministers and counterparts from more than a dozen hemispheric partners in Bogota. We explored coordinated regional approaches to address irregular migration challenges and specific steps countries can take to address its root causes. Our partners concurred we need a regional response and stressed their contributions would differ depending on their circumstances as source, transit, or destination country. We appreciate the efforts of countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and Chile in accepting large numbers of migrants. We continue to work with Brazil and Chile to accept the return of Haitians with prior status in those countries. We will work together to expand legal pathways for workers within the region to create inclusive economic opportunities in their countries of origin or long-term residence. We will strengthen law enforcement to dismantle trafficking networks and build on efforts to make it easier for migrants to return to their countries of prior residence and encourage removals for those ineligible for protection. Each partner will concentrate on immediate efforts with the long-term objective of crafting a stable, prosperous, and democratic future for their citizens and residents. As the Secretary said in his October 20 remarks in Ecuador, we find ourselves in a moment of democratic reckoning in the hemisphere and around the world. All of us who believe our shared future depends on the survival of democracy must ask, as the Secretary put it, what can we do to make democracies deliver on the issues that matter most to our people? In a region where 70% of citizens express dissatisfaction about how democracy works, we must combat corruption, enhance civilian security, and address the economic and social challenges facing the region's citizens to close the gap between democracy's promise and the reality. We work with partners to hold corrupt individuals and groups accountable, including through the new tool Congress created to fight corruption in Northern Central America, the Section 353 Corrupt and Undemocratic Actors List. we named over 50 corrupt actors in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to the list in a public display of accountability. As host of the 9th Summit of the Americas, we will uphold and expand upon our commitment to fight corruption and focus government, civil society, and the private sector on working together to increase inclusion, transparency, and accountability in government, and bolster and defend our democratic institutions. To enhance civilian security, the United States invests billions of dollars globally to reduce violence and combat transnational criminal organizations. But as the Secretary noted in his October 20th remarks in Quito, we need to pay more attention to addressing root causes of insecurity in our hemisphere. I joined Secretary Blinken, DHS Secretary Mayorkas, and Attorney General Garland at the October 8th High-Level Security Dialogue with Mexico, where our two governments adopted a new bicentennial framework based on partnership and shared responsibility for the safety and security of our two countries. The Secretary took a similar comprehensive and integrated approach at the October 21st U.S.-Colombia High-Level Dialogue. In the interest of time, I will conclude my remarks there, but submit the rest for the record and look forward to answering you and your colleagues' questions.
Thank you. We will now turn to questions. Secretary Nichols, let's talk a little bit about human rights in Cuba. Yesterday, we saw the Cuban regime once again stifle free expression and association by prohibiting peaceful protests and blocking activists and journalists from leaving their homes. How will the U.S. respond to the latest repression action by the Cuban regime, and what more do you need, and what more can we do to defend human rights to the Cuban people? And the second part of that question is, what progress has the administration made since July in expanding internet access on the island and supporting efforts to circumvent the restriction imposed by the regime?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to review events around what happened yesterday, it's a clear sign of the Cuban regime's fear of its own people's voice and their attempts to repress their legitimate desires for democracy and to set their own future. Cuban authorities arrested, blockaded, hospitalized, and detained activists from around the island, and they attempted to block internet access for certain individuals as well as networks and specific areas. Since the events in July, we've had 4 rounds of sanctions on those Cuban authorities who were responsible for the repression and abuse of their citizens, and we continue to look for opportunities to send concrete demonstrations of support for the Cuban people. I think as we look to the future, we need to continue to engage and support the Cuban people in their efforts to achieve democracy and freedom.
Thank you. You know, I was very upset last month when I saw that Nicaragua received $340 million. I just wonder, the International Monetary Fund gave them this money. Do we have any way of tracking what they do and just having a little say on some of this money? I mean, obviously they said that the money was going to vaccinate Nicaraguans, the people of Nicaragua. Well, the vaccination rate in Nicaragua is only 12%. So how do we influence the Monetary Fund to open their eyes and say, listen, $340 million is a lot of money and these people are not using it for the right thing? So how do we do that?
So, Mr. Chairman, the special drawing rights have to be converted into a usable currency. I've not seen any indication that the Nicaraguan authorities have yet converted the special drawing rights that they received from the IMF into an actual currency they can use to spend on something. I think as part of the Rey Nasser Act, we should be looking for opportunities to prevent Nicaragua from obtaining resources from international financial institutions, those funds would inevitably go to their corrupt government. So I think we need to be very vigilant in that area, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in the Treasury Department who oversee our relations with the international financial institutions to achieve that goal.
And my last question is, how can we help Colombia deal with the 2 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees that are in Colombia now?
So through our Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, as well as the U.S. Agency for International Development, we've provided over $740 million in assistance since 2017 to support Colombia's integration of the Venezuelan migrants. We were in Colombia in October, and President Duque talked about his extension of temporary protected status to Venezuelan migrants there. We continue to work through organizations like the International Organization for Migration and UNHCR to ensure that the international community response in support of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, as well as other parts of South America where there are also large communities of Venezuelan migrants like Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Brazil, are also receiving the assistance they need and coordinating throughout our hemisphere to support the necessary structures to help migration flow in a better and more regulated way.
Thank you. Now I turn over the questions to Ranking Member Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, on the kidnapped missionaries in Haiti, State hasn't given us an update in over 3 weeks, and that includes the offices who represent those individuals. Could you get us an update on the missionaries' status, what's going on, delivered either to HVAC or at a minimum to the offices that represent those people?
Yes, Ranking Member Green. We've held several briefings in the past, and we're happy to brief again.
Well, just a status update is what we need. You know, if we know where they're being held, et cetera, things like that. That would be very. We have to go back and reassure these people that we're doing something. You know, the families in these areas. So if you could do that, that'd be great. My next question. You know, FY21 ended with an all-time high, 1.7 million apprehensions at the U.S. southern border. Our regional partners are also seeing massive levels of migration. Can you provide a concrete example, just one, a single concrete example, where the Biden administration's strategy to address the root causes of migration has actually decreased migrant flows?
So I believe we have been successful in decreasing migrant flows.
Can you give me one example?
So, for example, in Guatemala, the centers that we have that address concerns of people thinking to migrate, I think that has diverted people out of illicit
So it would be
migration.
worse. It would be worse than it is had you not done that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Because it hasn't decreased, right? So I was just looking for maybe an example of where it had decreased the number. You'd seen a decrease in migration. You don't have. Do you have one?
So there are programs throughout the hemisphere. From Mexico, for example, has been very cooperative and responsive in trying to manage the migration.
But I guess I'm looking, and I hate to keep interrupting you, but I don't need. I'm just looking for an example where can you cite a difference that's been made, where there's been a decrease? Has there anywhere in the region been a decrease in migration since you guys have taken control?
Migration levels are at elevated levels throughout the hemisphere.
So the answer would be no, I guess. Let me move on to another question, if I could. I was recently in Brazil with President Bolsonaro and continue to be impressed by how the Brazilian government wants to align agendas with the United States. We've not seen this sense of like-mindedness in a Brazilian administration for some time. Congress and the administration need to support U.S. investors' ability to invest in Brazil and do more to support Brazil's entrance into the OECD. Also, while I was there, we got a briefing on their Navy. The opportunities for cooperation between our two countries in that regard, particularly as it relates to the South Atlantic, are great opportunities. How are you capitalizing on our joint priorities to advance strategic and U.S. interests with Brazil?
We have a close and broad relationship with Brazil. While I was at the UN General Assembly, I accompanied Secretary Blinken for a meeting with Foreign Secretary França. Also, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, met with his counterpart, Admiral Rocha. We actually, on Friday, I'll be having lunch with the Brazilian ambassador, and we're going to talk about these issues. We look forward to continued high-level exchanges with Brazil on a full range of issues.
Again, I hate to interrupt you, but we have such little time. Will we support their entrance into OECD?
Well, we're certainly working on that. There are a number of factors in play, but we believe that Brazil plays an important role both regionally and globally, and we want to encourage them to continue to play a positive role, for example, what they did at COP26.
Yeah. Would you do me a favor and just in writing send those factors that are in place so that we can better understand it? I have just a little bit of time left, so one more question. The ongoing pandemic has obviously exposed fault lines in our supply chain for essential equipment, life-saving drugs, et cetera. I'm working on the bill that you and I spoke about on the phone, and would love to provide you a copy of the legislation as it's being worked on. The special appointee to the Northern Triangle, Mr. Zuniga, at the time, I think he's since been promoted. Congratulations to him. But looked at it and reviewed it. I'd like to get your eyes on it and get the promise of some assistance. I really want this to be a bipartisan effort. I know many of the Democrats have reached out to me to be a part of this, so I'd just like to get your assurance that we can work together on that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Green. We now turn to Congressman Castro for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Assistant Secretary, for being here, for your testimony. Congratulations on your confirmation. We're glad that you got through, despite the holdup on many confirmations in the Senate. The Biden administration has prioritized addressing the root causes of migration, particularly in Central American countries. And there have been multiple reports of groups of migrants, largely composed of young women and children, being threatened, beaten, dragged, and chased by Mexican security forces. And I fear that the Mexican government is undertaking these actions because our government has put pressure on Mexico to stop migration and stop migrants, whatever the cost. And they may resort to these heavy-handed actions because of that. And so I wanted to see if you can assure us that the United States has not and will not ask the Mexican government to use force, violence, or intimidation against migrants.
Absolutely not. We work with the Mexican government to promote respect for the human rights and dignity of migrants, and the Mexican government has actually been reinforcing their structures, better shelters, better training, working with the International Organization of Migration to that end.
And what will we do, the United States government, to hold Mexican security units that commit such abuses accountable? And will we cut security assistance to those units as required by law?
We'll absolutely follow the law, and human rights is a crucial aspect of our foreign assistance engagement with all countries, and that's certainly the case with Mexico. But I would note that President Lopez Obrador and Mexican authorities broadly also stress the importance of respect for human rights in their public and private remarks.
Yeah, a key threat to democracy, stability, and human rights in Mexico is gang and drug-related violence, as you know. And a recent GAO report found that 70 to 90% of guns recovered in Mexico are from the United States, almost all illegally smuggled into the country. Will the State Department prioritize combating firearms trafficking from the United States to Mexico in our security cooperation with Mexico, especially under the new bicentennial framework?
Yes, there was something that was discussed during our meetings in Mexico City in October. Mexican authorities already have access to E-Trace to help them trace the guns that they find. U.S. law enforcement agencies coordinate closely with their Mexican counterparts, and we continue to promote those engagements and interactions. And I hope that, not to preview too much, but I hope that we'll have an announcement along those lines in connection with the North American Leaders Summit later this week.
Great. I have one more question, then I want to make a statement about the confirmations being held up in the Senate. But a question about Honduras. With the Honduras elections only weeks away, and given the United States' premature declaration of Juan Orlando Hernandez's win in 2017, what will the State Department do to monitor the November 28th elections?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, I'll be traveling to Honduras on Sunday. I'll be meeting with candidates as well as the Elections Council and government officials to discuss the importance of a free, fair, transparent, and peaceful electoral process. There's also an OAS electoral observation mission in Honduras, and we'll be following events closely. And we want to make sure that we analyze the vote and any outcomes carefully, and we will be judicious in our remarks.
Thank you. And in closing, I want to draw attention to a number of senior positions at the State Department and USAID that are still vacant, yet are critical for our leadership in the Western Hemisphere. These positions include the Assistant Secretaries for International Organization Affairs, for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, for International Security and Proliferation, and for Population, Refugees, and Migration, and ambassadors to NATO, Costa Rica, and Paraguay. Each of these individuals has had their hearing at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and received a vote in the committee. They are unable to start their jobs because Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Josh Hawley are jeopardizing our national security by refusing to allow a vote on the Senate floor for their nominations. I hope these senators drop their unreasonable demands soon and you have a fully staffed State Department to advance our priorities in the Western Hemisphere and around the world. Thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Castro. Now we'll turn over to Representative Salazar.
Thank you, and wonderful to be able to talk to you, Mr. Nichols, and congratulations on your new position. I believe, sir, that Latin America is not a priority for this administration, and unfortunately, the empirical evidence proves it. As a result, we are losing our influence in the Americas, and China and Russia are pillaging Latin America while we are asleep. Let me just talk to you about 3 different countries that I'm interested, so please make your answers not too long. Cuba. For 4 months, sir, I have been asking your administration, the Biden administration, the State Department, for one thing: internet connectivity to the island. Your deputy promised to brief me personally on the progress the State Department has been making on bringing connectivity to Cuba, and that meeting has not occurred. So my question to you is, sir, have you done the due diligence with the companies that can provide that technology to Cuba? There are 2 companies that we can talk to. Have you done that due diligence?
Our technical experts have been in touch with the private sector as well as U.S. government experts to discuss ways to improve internet access on the island.
I'm talking about 2 specific companies that have the technology ready to go so you can do the due diligence and the White House can give the final approval and we can put those balloons up in the air. Are you aware who those 2 companies are?
So there's no magic bullet to solve the internet.
Sure there is. The technology is out there and we can at least try it. And that's my frustration. This administration doesn't even want to do the due diligence. There's no willingness to bring connectivity to the island of Cuba. Are you aware of that, sir?
We are working to increase access to the internet. I would note that during yesterday's protest, there was not a broad switch off of internet access.
Yes, there is, and I'm so sorry. You keep on telling me the same thing that everyone tells me, and that is not true. But if you want me, I can have a private conversation with you and tell you where that technology is. Now let's go to Mexico. On Thursday, sir, President AMLO, López Obrador, is going to be welcomed to Washington. And I'm sure you remember that López Obrador received Díaz-Canel as a king. Not even Fidel Castro was received like that in Mexican soil. And there is a report from your State Department that says that Mexico is profiting from the human trafficking and forced labor of Cuban doctors on Mexican soil. That violates USMCA, the free trade agreement between Mexico and the United States. Are you going to confront, or are you going to ask the Biden administration to ask AMLO about these two atrocities?
We discuss human rights around the hemisphere with our counterparts in Mexico, and we continue to advocate for the key values of.
But specifically, is it on the agenda now when López Obrador is coming to Washington to address specifically these two things that I just pointed out?
We're going to have a robust dialogue about a range of issues, including the human rights situation in the hemisphere.
Specifically in Cuba. Thank you. Now let's go to Colombia. President Biden's top advisor, his name is Juan González, said that Mr. Biden no tiene idea quién es Gustavo Petro. He has no idea who Gustavo Petro is. I'm going to tell you who he is. He's a thief, he's a socialist, he's a Marxist, he's a terrorist, and he's leading the polls for president of Colombia. Do you share my opinion about Petro?
I served as deputy chief of mission in our embassy in Bogota. I have met him, and just note that the election is a decision for the people of Colombia.
I'm asking you, what do you, the State Department, thinks about Mr. Petro?
I don't
What's your opinion of him?
I'm not going to characterize the candidates in Colombia. We note that it's a decision for the Colombian people, and we hope for a free, fair, and transparent process.
But you want the best for the people of Colombia, and you do not want a Marxist in power, do you? Someone that is undermining the Colombian democracy. I'm asking you.
We look forward to a free, fair, and transparent process in Colombia that reflects the will of the Colombian people. We have a long-standing alliance and relationship.
Let's go to Venezuela. The Biden administration, sir, has eliminated the role of a special envoy. It has not nominated a single political appointee for Venezuela and has not met with Juan Guaido. And my question to you is, sir, are you planning, the Biden administration, the State Department is planning to throw the legitimate president of Venezuela under the bus?
We recognize the interim president, Guaido, and his government. We continue to work with them closely and don't expect any change in that regard.
So you are telling me that you are not
Congresswoman.
planning to recognize the Maduro regime?
Congresswoman, we're going to do a second round of questioning. So I need
And
to
just to see if he can get that on the record. You're not planning to recognize the Maduro regime?
I don't see any change in our position.
Good for
Krueger.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I have a couple of questions on Venezuela. When it comes to the influence of China, Russia, Iran, I think there's a very disturbing trend of influence, not just in Venezuela, but all throughout the Western Hemisphere, specifically in South America. Kind of characterize to me your thoughts on this influence as it relates to energy inside Venezuela.
So the nations that you mentioned provide a lifeline to the Maduro regime. They facilitate the evasion of sanctions imposed by not just the United States, but countries around the world against the Maduro regime. It's a very problematic relationship. In addition to direct sanctions evasion, they also provide a financial lifeline to the Maduro regime that's deeply worrisome. It's reflective of their lack of respect for the Venezuelan people that they would support this regime.
So if there are ways to counter this with, like you just said, free, fair transparency, whether it's in elections or business dealings or all of the above, I mean, is that something that the administration would be willing to look at, in Venezuela? I mean, there's American companies that have been there that provide that stability, that actually do quite a bit of good inside the country. Unfortunately, they're going through a very tough time right now. And I think that the question for you is, would the administration support looking at ways to counter the influence, malign influence of those three countries to the benefit of the people of Venezuela?
Well, it's certainly absolutely something that we look at, we talk about regularly. I'll just note that we support the negotiation process between the Unitary Platform and the Maduro regime, and we believe that it's the interim government that should be determining who gets to invest in Venezuela and what the roles are there, and that's something that we look to them to help orient us.
Can you talk to me about any concerns with regards to energy and the people of Venezuela either suffering or not having access to affordable, reliable energy?
Well, certainly the suffering of the people of Venezuela is the responsibility of the Maduro regime, which is imposed, and Chavez before it, has imposed decades of poor economic policies, massive corruption and graft. So that's what causes the suffering of their people. But I would note that we hope that on the negotiating table in Mexico City, if the Maduro regime returns, they will address humanitarian issues, including access to health care, education, food, and secure, reliable energy.
Kind of moving on to the second topic, and I appreciate that. I think that it's important for us to work very closely. These are complex issues, but at the end of the day, we want the people to be able to have access to food, to energy, to all the basic human needs. And there are American companies who I think are positioned very well to counter the malign influence of countries like Iran, Russia, and China. I'd like to ask you some questions about what Panama is doing with regards to their use of biometrics and the identification of people who may end up on a known or suspected terror list or be criminal actors that are migrants that are traveling from South America through Central America, and how the administration is working with countries like Panama to then expand that throughout the region. And are you looking to make some sort of effort to standardize this? Because it's the Panamanian government has recently told us that they have identified 52 people that have qualified for the known or suspected terror list that have been migrants. So what efforts are the administration making to this end?
So this is a big priority for us to coordinate with countries throughout the migrant routes, and Panama is a crucial one because of a big migrant movement that goes from the Darien on the Colombian side to the Darien on the Panamanian side. We've met, I think I've met with Foreign Minister Muniz of Panama more than any other foreign minister. I think I've had 5 meetings with her. We talk about migration issues regularly. The meeting in Bogota, chaired by Secretary Blinken, coordinated on those issues. Undersecretary Zaya visited Panama and reviewed these issues on the ground with them. So it's a very close relationship, and we want to keep doing more.
Well, thank you. I'll wait for the second round to follow up. Yield.
Thank you, Congressman. Looks like we're not going to make the second round since the votes have been called, but I want to make sure that I ask unanimous consent that my friend Chris Smith participate in today's hearing.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for that courtesy, and to the ranking member as well. I'll be very brief. I first met Daniel Ortega in my second term in 1984, and he was then a serial abuser of human rights. It was a very contentious meeting. We met with Tomas Borge and all the others that were a part of that dictatorship, and nothing has changed. If not, it has gotten worse. In July, I chaired a hearing of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. We heard from Victoria Cardenas and also with Berta Valle. As you know, both their husbands are in prison and would have stood for election, probably would have won at least one of them or one of the others who have been put into prison. I know when you said in your testimony, Secretary Nichols, that a number of sanctions have gone out against individuals. I deeply appreciate that. But I'm asking if you would consider, I remember working with Armando Valladares when he got the first group to visit the Cuban prisons under Ronald Reagan. It was an amazing 7 weeks at the Human Rights Commission then, not the council. And he got that resolution passed, and I know you point out that there's a Human Rights Council resolution as well as OAS as well. If there could be added or a new one that would say a visit to those individuals, because we're not sure, one of those men has lost 30 pounds, is in dire straits. He could pass away. And again, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership on the renunciation of legislation, which is a tremendous boost, I think, to try to promote democracy and freedom there. But again, to get a visit, the ICRC would be another group that could be encouraged to go and visit them, hopefully with the thought of getting them out. They are unjustly imprisoned, as you know, as we all know. But it might work to do it at the Human Rights Council, because it's been done before. There is precedent for it.
Representative Smith, I agree wholeheartedly. I also met with Vicky Cardenas and Bertha Valle last week, and just note that the OAS General Assembly resolution on Nicaragua calls for the immediate release of political prisoners. I talked to Secretary General Almagro about the importance of him taking action to implement that resolution, but the additional ideas that you put forward are absolutely well taken, and I agree 100%.
About visits. That's great. Thank you. Go back, and I thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could I have Representative Pfluger consume the remaining time for Ranking Member Smith?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary, in talking about USMCA, we have some serious concerns about, and I know it's been discussed already, but on the upholding of the trade agreement, there are a variety of issues. The reason that we go down these paths of either bilateral or preferential trade agreements is because the other frameworks don't seem to be doing it. So it's very important that the administration communicate our needs. In discussions with the USTR, we've also brought this up. Can you please tell me which items are going to be discussed tomorrow with regards to USMCA?
So I don't want to totally preview the president's meeting, but I will say that there will be a broad discussion of integrating North American supply chains, labor issues, ensuring that we continue to make progress in North American energy integration, are some examples of the issues in USMCA.
I would just urge that the members of the Texas delegation in a bipartisan manner have sent letters concerning our concerns with regards to energy, and especially U.S. companies doing business in Mexico, and would urge the administration to take a look at this to make sure that what we signed up to within the framework of USMCA is actually upheld, and that the Mexican government looks at this and takes it very, very seriously to continue to have free trade, because right now the trend is away from that and not in line with the agreement. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. I yield back.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Assistant Secretary Nichols, for joining us today. You have a big job with all the problems that we have in the Western Hemisphere. We only touched on a few of the issues that are important. And I look forward to working with you and my colleagues in Congress on a bipartisan basis to ensure we engage more closely with our partners and allies in the Western Hemisphere. As this region emerges from the pandemic and contends with serious threats to democratic values and fundamental human rights, our support has never been more important. With that, hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for coming.
They just go votes, otherwise we would have had you here a little longer.